Everybody. Welcome to this Poynter Fellowship talk from People's Car to Public Fraud, I think is what we called it, the Volkswagen scandal. I'm delighted to be joined by our Poynter Fellow, Jack Ewing, who I'll introduce in a second. I did want to tell you just a little bit about the Poynter Fellowship. We're grateful to be hosting this event in collaboration with our colleagues of the Office of Public Affairs here at Yale. The Poynter Fellowship is named for Nelson Poynter, who's a member of the Yale class of 1927, and he established this program to bring distinguished reporters, editors, and others who have made important contributions to the media to Yale to engage in conversation with members of our community on the work that they do. And this year, the program hopes to address the theme of fact-based journalism under siege. I think, well, the originators of that theme probably thought about other types of fact-based journalism that is under siege. In this particular case, the subject of our story very much had a relationship with facts that was perhaps a little bit unusual or loose, and we'll be speaking quite a bit about that. Of course, what has brought us here is Jack's work on the Volkswagen scandal. Here's my copy of the book, heavily marked up. I couldn't put it down. If you haven't already read it and you're interested, there will be some books available outside the room after the session, and Jack has agreed to sign them. So that's an additional benefit of being here. I want to also welcome people following us on the web. We're transmitting this session live to the global network and beyond, and we're glad that all of you can join us. Jack writes about business, banking, economics, and monetary policy from Frankfurt for the New York Times. He's been doing that since 2010. He previously worked at Business Week and at Bloomberg, and first moved to Europe in 1993 as a German Marshall Fund journalist. Even though he's come all the way from Germany to join this conversation, this is very much coming close to home. Your career started at the Hartford Courant, or at least that was an important destination, and so we're glad that you're back here in Connecticut to share with us your insights about the Volkswagen scandal, how we got to where we are, where this story might be going next, what it says about business, what it says about Germany, what it says about engineering, all kinds of questions. I'll start out with a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. I'm just curious, before we get started, by show of hands, how many of you have ever owned a Volkswagen car? Okay. How many of you currently still own a Volkswagen car? How many are here in part because you're upset about? All right. All right, there you go. We're going to get to some of those issues. So Jack, we were talking earlier today about when you first got the call, I suppose, from New York, that there was a story developing involving Volkswagen. They wanted a German perspective. And you said that it wasn't quite clear how big this was going to be. Can you just describe how you first learned about this, and how quickly did you realize that this was going to be a major story that would be occupying a lot of your time over the next couple of years?
Yeah. Well, first of all, David, thanks very much for having me today. It's really a great privilege to be speaking here at the School of Management. The way the story got started was the world learned of this, the general public, was when the EPA put out a press release, I believe it was September 19th, 2015, saying that Volkswagen had confessed to putting illegal software in its cars that allowed it, that deceived regulators about the true emissions. And I was asked our EPA reporter, Coral Davenport, picked up the story when they asked me to get involved to provide the context about Volkswagen and the German perspective. And we knew it was going to be a big story. They put it on the front page the first time when this happened. But it took a couple of days before we really realized what a big deal it was going to be. I mean, initially the EPA said it was about 500,000 cars. It soon became clear that it was all of the cars in the world that had this particular engine, 11 million cars. And that's when we realized that this was a scandal really on the same level as Enron or any of the big corporate scandals, in that it involved a massive deception that had continued over almost a decade and was international in scope.
And you started to touch on this towards the end now about why this story has been, why it's such a big story. What is sort of distinctive about it? Why it ranks with Enron and other sort of big corporate scandals that we teach about here in business school to make sure our students learn how to not fall into those same traps. So what are some of the factors you think that have made this such a big story, one that really hasn't gone away 2 years in? There's still frequent coverage about the Volkswagen scandal.
I think there's a couple of elements. I mean, one is just the public health aspect. You had these cars that were spewing more nitrogen oxides, which is a very harmful chemical, at a level that was higher than a long-haul truck. This has very serious health implications, particularly in Europe, where most of the cars were. Nitrogen oxides cause asthma. People get heart attacks when they breathe too much nitrogen oxides. It's been linked to cancer. It causes smog. It's pretty nasty stuff. And so these Volkswagen was producing far more of this, was responsible for a real public health problem. I think the second thing was sort of the scope of the deception. There was clear intent in that they had installed software in the cars that was specifically designed to detect when a test was taking place and tell the cars to ramp up the pollution control so that they looked clean, and the rest of the time they polluted as much as they wanted. Plus, and we were talking about this earlier, Volkswagen was at the same time advertising that these were clean diesels. And I don't know if anybody remembers seeing the ad campaign, but around 2010, 2011, they were buying commercials on the Super Bowl. Very clever, creative marketing work, all about how clean these cars were and suggesting that if you bought one, you were environmentally virtuous. So it wasn't just that they were deceiving the regulators, it was a big consumer fraud. And I think those are really the two things that caused it to be such a big scandal and also so expensive for Volkswagen.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about what they thought might happen if they got caught and what it is. Or actually, maybe we preview this, actually. Your research has suggested that they thought when they were sort of thinking about what the worst is that might happen, they thought, what was the amount of the fine that might happen?
About $5 million.
$5 million. And the current estimate of what the total damage might be is?
Well, just in the US, it's already getting close to $25 billion.
Yeah.
But that's just in the US, and there's still legal liabilities outstanding in the rest of the world.
And that doesn't include sort of the destroyed reputation.
Right.
And
Right.
All right. So we're going to try to figure out how you get it so wrong, not just how you behave improperly, but then also get your assessment of the risk so terribly wrong. So I'm curious. You had been there for some time covering German business. Can you say a little bit about Volkswagen and the place it occupies in the German industrial landscape, and perhaps what your views, if any, of the company had been prior to this?
Yeah, well, I think Volkswagen is definitely one of the iconic German brands.
Yeah.
It played a huge role in Germany's economic recovery after World War II. The Beetle, which was actually invented by the Nazis but never really produced in great numbers before the war, was really the product that Volkswagen was built on, and that played a big role in Germany becoming the major auto producer that it is. It's a huge employer, certainly one of the top 3 employers, 600,000 people worldwide. I think about half of those are in Germany. And it's also politically very important because in the state of Lower Saxony, where Volkswagen headquarters is located, basically the entire state economy revolves around Volkswagen. It's by far the biggest employer. You have lots of suppliers, plus the state owns a 20% stake, so there's a very close connection between the state and Volkswagen. And Lower Saxony is also historically kind of a launching pad for national politicians. So if you've been the prime minister of Lower Saxony, you've sat on the Volkswagen supervisory board, and Gerhard Schröder, former chancellor, was from Lower Saxony, had been on the supervisory board. Sigmar Gabriel was the foreign minister. Christian Wolff, who became president. So there's just incredible links between the economy and politics and this company.
So one of the things that you did, and with the support of your editors at the New York Times, was to not just report on what was happening, sort of matter of fact, but you dug in, and it almost became investigative journalism, which I assume is not the way you often work, but in this case, it's almost forensic journalism is what it became. What did you learn about the company that really surprised you? I mean, you had known about the importance of the company and the political ties, perhaps, but what are some of the things that you learned that really surprised you about Volkswagen?
Well, one thing, and to sort of answer a question that you asked before, I'd been covering Volkswagen off and on for 20 years, and it was always a very difficult company to deal with. Yeah. Just they didn't like foreign reporters, they didn't like the financial press, and it was a big contrast to BMW or Daimler, who I also deal a lot with. We're always very accommodating, get you access to top executives. Volkswagen was always very closed, and you really sensed it was a different kind of culture. And then when this whole scandal came out, Volkswagen, I think, had a lot of trouble. I think because of this tradition of not being very transparent, they had a lot of trouble dealing with it, and are still having a lot of trouble dealing with it. And as a reporter, we were trying to go beyond just the information that was coming out kind of on its own and try to get inside the company and to find out from the people who were involved what exactly had happened. My editors very quickly said, this is a whodunit, we want you to solve it in like a week, which was not really practical. But over time, I was able to develop enough sources that I felt I had a pretty good idea of what actually had happened inside the company.
So we're not going to treat this as a mystery. People should buy the book if they want to know what actually happened. But I'm sure you get the question a lot when you meet people at a cocktail party. I'm Jack, what'd you do? I just wrote a book about the Volkswagen scandal. Somebody says, so what really did happen? So give us sort of the cocktail chatter version of what happened, and then we can unpack some of the pieces.
Well, I think it started when Volkswagen around 2006, 2007, they decided they were going to become the biggest car company in the world. And that was sort of the guiding principle for the whole company, that they wanted to go, at that time they were smaller than GM, they were smaller than Toyota, they wanted to blow past both of them. And then to do that, they needed to get much bigger in the United States. They were very successful. They were the biggest car maker in Europe by far, with 25% of the market, very big in China, very big in Latin America, but in the United States, still a niche brand. And the US had been a problem for them for decades. So they decided they wanted to make a big push in the United States market, and they started thinking, okay, what's our unique selling point? They were already a leader in diesel in Europe, and diesel had been a big part of their success in Europe because they were able to take this technology and make it work in small cars with better fuel economy, good performance. They thought that's what we'll sell in the United States, and that will be a way to compete with Toyota and its Prius. And so that was their goal, but when they were setting that goal, they didn't really look hard enough at how practical it was. And so as they started developing the engine that they were going to sell in the United States, they discovered that it could not meet the US emission standards, which for nitrogen oxides are stricter than they are in Europe. And so this was where the corporate goals and sort of physical reality collided. And I think that's also the point where at a healthy company, you would have had a discussion about, okay, how do we deal with this? Do we spend more money on emissions equipment? Do we change our goals? What do we do? And Volkswagen made the decision basically to cheat. The way that they solved this problem was to come up with software that got around it rather than solving the underlying emissions problem. And I think they initially saw that as a stopgap. This is something that would just help them get the cars on the market when they had planned to. But and then they would improve the technology, but then it became a habit.
And one of the things that I hadn't read anywhere until I saw that in your book is that the blueprint for that technical solution, we'll put solution in quotation marks because you really haven't solved anything when you're cheating, actually came out of a completely different part of the business and was about noise or noise reduction? What?
Yeah, the software had originally been invented by Audi, which is a division of Volkswagen, the luxury car division of Volkswagen. And they had been on the market with diesel sooner than Volkswagen. You know, they always bring the innovations into the high end of the market first. And they had a problem around the early 2000s where the cars went, before they were warmed up, the diesel engine would make kind of a clattering sound. And that was not consistent with the sort of quiet luxury image that they were trying to convey. So they came up with software, which they call the acoustic function, which turned down the emissions system and retuned the motor in a way that was quieter, but also exceeded emissions regulations. And they had set it up so that when the car was being tested, it would make more noise, but be compliant. The rest of the time, it would be, during normal use, it would be quiet. So that was sort of the beginning of using software to get around an emissions problem. And then several years later, the engineers at Volkswagen picked up on that software and then adapted it for their own problem.
And one of the things that you describe in the book is that it started perhaps as a stopgap measure, engineers being put between a rock and a hard place, corporate goals and physical possibilities, right? But not only did the stopgap measure remain and it wasn't removed, but they kept upgrading it as they introduced new engines. Say a little bit more about that, because again, a lot of us sort of got the headline figure, defeat device, but there were multiple defeat devices and multiple engines.
Right. And that's one of the kind of the mystifying things about the whole scandal, and I think that sort of shows what the corporate culture is at Volkswagen, because they had numerous points when, sort of technical crossroads, when they could have upgraded the software, they could have become legal, they could have gone clean, and I think would never have been discovered. And yet each time they reached one of these crossroads, they always decided to keep cheating. I mean, around 2012, they built a factory in Chattanooga to start producing Passats in the United States for the US market. And they, at that point, switched to a different emissions technology that could have worked, but it requires you to fill a tank with a certain chemical. They thought that the US buyers wouldn't like that, so they programmed the cars to ration this chemical, pollute more than they were allowed, and then it again put in software that would fool the regulators. So that was a point where it wouldn't have been that hard to be compliant, and yet they decided not to. And if you look at the story, this happened over and over again. Even after they were caught, they continued to destroy documents and basically commit obstruction of justice. And the consistency with which that happens just makes you think there had to be something really strange about the corporate culture.
So I want to talk more about the corporate culture, because that in particular seems so just startling. And to hone in on this, just to be clear about the choices that they made and the motivation, perhaps. So these engineers, did they become fabulously wealthy doing this, or no? Okay,
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing that separates this from like the banking scandals, Enron. You know, if you look at the LIBOR scandal or something like that, those were people who were, wanted to make more money.
Yeah.
They wanted to make their bonuses. There was a clear financial incentive. Yeah. And in the Volkswagen story, I haven't found a single person who made more money from this. It was all about just meeting the pressures that they were under and just keeping their jobs.
So I mean, just you think about it, the motivation is we really don't like the noise when the engine comes on, so let's cheat the emission standards. Or, you were talking about AdBlue, right? This chemical substance, which would have offered a solution, but I guess they didn't like the fact that you would have to refill it more frequently than the service intervals.
Right.
So for a German mind around, symmetry and structure and all of that, this is sort of deeply disturbing. And so you just cheat. I mean, it just seems that, you know, what they were cheating for was sort of, I don't know, you say corporate pressure, but then there's sort of the engineering aesthetics or how they thought that the product would be. I mean, in what kind of a setting do people make choices like that? And now in hindsight, you know, put the entire survival of the company at stake over the sound when the engine gets turned on, or, you know, you don't want people to refill every, you know, 2,000 miles. It should be every 6,000 miles, and so we got to cheat.
Well, I guess in a way, I mean, it shows how meticulous they were about building cars and how sort of, in a way, how customer-oriented they were. I mean, they were very focused on what the customer.
So they were really cheating on behalf of the customers. They were thinking.
I guess you could say that. You know, I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
I mean, with the chemical tank, I mean, they had two choices. They could ask people to refill it more often, or they could have made the tank bigger.
Yes.
But that would have then taken room from the trunk. You know, building a car it's a jigsaw puzzle, getting all the pieces to fit in a way that provides maximum space and still does everything that a car needs to do. It would have made the trunk smaller. That means when Road and Track did the review, they always measured the trunk space, and if you have, you know, 10 cubic inches less than a BMW, then that's hurts you in the market. So, you know, I guess it was partly the customer, and also that the auto business is very competitive.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to cede any competitive advantages. And I think the other thing is, you know, in fairness to Volkswagen, is consumers never ask about emissions. Very few do. No one says, you know, do you have an SCR or a NOx trap or something? How does the emission system work? It's not a selling point. So I think the car companies, not just Volkswagen, look at it as something they have to do, and that's kind of incentive to do the minimum.
Yeah. And then, so they continue this, and we talked about this before. It's still not entirely clear up to what part in the organization knowledge of the actual solution, in quotation marks, went. But you mentioned before your estimate of how many people in the organization must have had a sense of this is?
I've been told by people who were involved that it was in the hundreds, maybe over 1,000 people who were aware that this illegal software was present in the cars, and it had specific knowledge of it, and probably hundreds who were involved in making it work in one way or another.
Sorry.
Yeah, so it's a vast conspiracy, I think you could say. You know, it's a very large number of people.
Over a 10-year period of time, and while the marketing department is out there saying, clean diesel, this isn't your, you know, father's diesel or whatever, you know, the engineer's like, well, it's not that clean, but, you know, the trunk is big, so I guess it's okay.
Right.
I mean, it just...
And they told, I think the other way that they justified it to themselves, and I think that's actually an interesting element of any corporate scandal, is how do the people justify it to themselves, because that's always plays a role, that diesel does, at least when these engines came out, diesel produces less carbon dioxide per mile traveled than a gasoline car. Diesel is more efficient use of it. You get more energy out of a gallon of diesel than you do out of a gallon of gasoline. So they told themselves they were doing something good for the planet. And the nitrogen oxide, well, you know, that was just the price you had to pay.
And that, in many ways, reflected a difference in environmental policy priorities, right? Where in the U.S., much of environmental regulation has been about, you know, clean air and smog and nitrogen oxide, and relationship with climate change that is complicated, to say the least, right? You know, certainly contested, whereas I guess in Europe for 2 decades, broad consensus around doing something about climate change first and foremost, and a whole lot less awareness about sort of low altitude air pollution, the impact on kids in terms of asthma and so on.
Right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think U.S. regulation is driven a lot by California and Los Angeles, where you have smog, which is caused by nitrogen oxide. So that played a big role in the sort of regulatory thinking. And Europe, as you say, was focused on more on global warming. I mean, the environmental groups in Europe have been saying for years, and you can go back and find their press releases and their studies saying, hey, you know, if the cars are as clean as the car makers claim they are, how come we still have these really high levels of nitrogen oxides in our cities, but no one really listened to them until the Volkswagen scandal. And I guess one of the sort of silver linings of the whole thing is it has focused attention on that problem.
And you know, to Europe's shame in many ways, not only did European regulators not notice this, but even European NGOs didn't, right? I mean, who brought this whole thing to light?
Well, it was it started with the group called the International Council on Clean Transportation, which is sort of a bicontinental organization. They have an office in Berlin and an office in Washington. It was formed by mostly ex-regulators who were a little frustrated by what they thought was the capture of the regulatory process by the industry. Yeah. And they were the one who commissioned this study by the West Virginia University, which first called attention to this discrepancy in the road versus the lab emissions.
So that to me was one of the most interesting chapters. Is, you know, if you're in academia, you really empathize for the graduate students and the postdocs who were, you know, building their own road testing devices, attaching them. I mean, they're literally like put the exhaust into the cabin and had their detectors there and all of that, you know, and put that together and brought down, in some ways, one of the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah, well, it was they had a $70,000 grant. And as you say, it was a bunch of graduate students. Yeah. I would say, very dedicated graduate students buying things at hardware stores to make the equipment work. Yeah. And I mean, it's incredible, and I think, you know, a huge management failing that you, if you're in charge of a company and you create a vulnerability, so you make yourself so vulnerable that you can be brought down by a bunch of graduate students. That's, you know, that's incredible.
You can't underestimate graduate students ever, you know, as a former graduate student. So we have a lot of graduate students in the room, so it's a good transition. Let me pause and take a couple of questions from the audience. And I have some follow-up questions, but I think it's a good point to take a few questions. And if you could just identify yourself briefly at the beginning before you ask your question. Any questions? Yeah, let's start right here, and then we'll go up there. Please.
I'm Julia Armus. I work here at the SOM. The other sort of thing that this sounds a lot like, and I don't think it's been mentioned yet, we've said Enron and some of the financial scandals, but have you thought about the comparisons with big tobacco, and in particular with the light cigarettes, especially when you're talking about defeating testing? That really sounded very familiar to me. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the similarities and differences with, say, what Philip Morris did over decades.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very good analogy, and something that I didn't really get into too much in the book, and I'm actually hoping to write about in the future. But there is, one of the similarities is you have a lot of research about nitrogen oxides and what their health effects are, and there's always a certain amount of ambiguity because it's really impossible to trace nitrogen oxides coming out of a tailpipe and then causing some kid to get asthma. And the auto companies, and Volkswagen in particular, exploited these ambiguities to try to convince legislators that the evidence of the health effects was not conclusive. And just quite recently, the German parliament had a investigative commission that looked at the whole Volkswagen scandal, and they had witnesses testifying about what the health effects are. And they had some saying that the health effects are quite serious, which I think is the consensus in the scientific community, but they also had specialist experts who were well known for doing studies that are financed by the auto industry and that usually conclude that there's nothing to worry about. And this was in the German parliament. I think it shows the continued political influence of the car companies, at least in Germany. I'm not as qualified to talk about the rest of the world, but I think certainly in Europe, it's a health hazard that's been out there that the car companies have deliberately obscured and which is only now becoming clear.
Yeah. Emma Yamamoto. I'm a first-year MBA student. I was curious a little bit about how Volkswagen's identity is really tied with Germany and how you feel that may have influenced, kind of the inability to admit failure or to admit a mistake when trying to remediate some of these issues?
I would say that it's more a specific Volkswagen thing than a German thing. I mean, maybe it sort of has its roots in German culture, but if I compare Volkswagen to BMW or Daimler, which I also have a lot of contact with, they're very international. They realized a long time ago that they had to sort of adopt an international mentality. They have lots of people from all over the world working in Germany, and Volkswagen is much more insular. And in a way that goes back to history, when the Nazis decided to put the factory in Wolfsburg, which was in the middle of nowhere, not near any big population centers. So it's now a quite sizable city surrounded by a number of large, it's become a whole metropolitan area, but it all revolves around Volkswagen. So you have this kind of bubble where everybody works for Volkswagen or is dependent on Volkswagen in some way. And so I think that they are still having a lot of trouble understanding how the rest of the world perceives that. But I would say that's more of a kind of specific Volkswagen thing than anything that really speaks about Germany.
So say a little bit more about the specific culture. You've spoken about the culture before and sort of asked yourself almost the question of what kind of a culture creates a situation where so many people go along with this for so long. What do people need to know about the corporate culture at Volkswagen?
Well, I think it really stems from one person who was the Ferdinand Piëch, who was the grandson of Ferdinand Porsche, who actually was the designer of the Beetle. He worked his way up in the car industry through Audi, and then in the early 90s became chief executive of Volkswagen when the company was in a severe crisis.
Right. And he's a business person. He got an MBA, or what is his background?
No, he's totally engineering background.
Not an MBA. Good thing.
No, definitely not. You can't blame this one on the MBAs.
All right.
No, he went to the Technical University of Zurich.
Okay.
And totally an engineer, and I think even his detractors would say an automotive genius, but also has a very trying to think of how to put this politely, he's a pretty amoral type of person in the way that he's known for being very harsh with subordinates, telling people, this is what I want you to do. If you don't do it, you're going to be fired. And very cold, very willing to punish people who don't meet his expectations. And an interesting thing is everybody knew this about him when he was promoted from head of Audi to head of the whole company, but they were in a total crisis. And so they were willing to sort of overlook his rough edges because they knew they needed somebody very strong. And then he went on to dominate the company for 20 years, and he's the one who really created the corporate culture that exists at Volkswagen today. You know, maybe there were some elements already there, but if you look at the previous CEOs, some of them were much more egalitarian and democratic, tried to loosen up the company, and he really created this extremely authoritarian, almost sort of personalized way of managing the company. And under him, there was a number of scandals. There was a corporate espionage scandal soon after he came into office. There was a prostitution scandal in the early 2000s where the company was paying for the labor leaders to visit brothels and make trips to Brazil to tour the brothels in Brazil and on the company tab as a way of keeping the labor compliant. And each time there was a scandal, there was no real reform. They used their political clout to pretty much make it go away. A few people took the fall. The company never changed. So I think the signal that if you were getting, if you worked at Volkswagen, was if you can get away with it, it's okay.
And in addition to Piëch as a leader and his authoritarian tendencies and this sort of rule by fear, what can you tell us about the diversity of the top management team? Who were the people around him? Who got promoted?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was no diversity. I mean, there's not a single person of color, I don't think, ever been on the Volkswagen board. They were all Germans, men who went through the same small number of technical schools. Most have spent their whole careers at Volkswagen. They were all engineers. There was one guy from Spain. I think that was as diverse as it got.
Yeah.
And,
And he was the subject of a scandal, right?
Right.
The way they brought him
he
in.
was part of the corporate espionage scandal, but survived and then became the head of procurement. Yeah, so, and in fact, the first woman on the Volkswagen management board ever was after the scandal when they brought in a former German Supreme Court justice, supposedly to clean up compliance and culture, and she lasted a little more than a year. Yeah. So it's a very, it's company lifers, male engineer car guys. So I think that was another big element of the culture, not enough outside voices.
And a lot of companies struggle with a lack of diversity. Certainly, I think to some extent, European companies, perhaps even more than American companies, but you would say that even with that, Volkswagen was sort of at one end of the spectrum. I mean, it's not representative in that way of all European or German companies.
Yeah, well, it's still true in Germany that most boards are dominated by white males, but Volkswagen, I think, was an extreme case, and their efforts to diversify have not been very successful. I mean, I think the other key thing is it's not only before the scandal, but after the scandal, they haven't really changed. I mean, it's the chief executive, Martin Winterkorn, resigned a couple of days after the whole thing became public. There was a couple of other departures, but basically the people on the management board are the same group that's been in charge of the company.
They didn't bring in an outside CEO to clean this up, or?
No, and I think that's a big reason why they're still struggling with it, because I don't really think that you can change a company culture with the same group of people. No matter how hard no matter how sincere they may be. I'm not sure they are sincere, but even if they wanted to, I think it's just very difficult if you're a company insider.
There's a couple of questions. Let's start over here, and then we'll go over here. Yeah.
Hi, Camilla. I work here at S1. What was the response in Germany after the scandal? I mean, obviously it had some, because it has some political clout. Did it affect in any way? What has people said in Germany itself?
Well, I think the initial reaction I think it was sort of divided. There were some Germans who were just as angry as Americans, Volkswagen owners, who also bought the cars thinking they were clean, and they were just as upset about it as buyers anywhere else. I think there was a significant number of people who thought that Volkswagen was being persecuted by the US regulators. This was a plot to keep Volkswagen out of the US market and protect the American car makers. I think recently there's been a real pivot in public opinion because it took a while, but it's recently dawned on, I think, the German public how harmful the nitrogen oxides are. There's there's a lot of data showing that although in theory emissions should have gone down with improvements in the technology, they've stayed flat, and it's because of cheating. And so that's only very recently become a political issue, and diesel's market share is now plunging, especially in Germany. It was about half the cars sold in Germany were diesels, and that's now dropped to about 40% in a pretty short period of time. So there's sort of a belated backlash taking place in Germany and Europe in general.
And just to highlight how divergent these markets are, we think often globalization means, there aren't really these significant differences. 50 or 60% of new passenger cars in Europe being diesel. In the US, the comparable figure was 2%, 3%, something like that.
Before Volkswagen started the clean diesel push, I think there was 17,000 diesel passenger cars in the United States out of, 10 million cars on the road or something. It was, totally insignificant.
Right. And so a lot of that being, again, a reflection of different rules, different regulations, different companies that then pursue strategies based on those things.
Right, well, and the car makers had convinced the governments that diesel was more environmentally friendly, and so diesel is de facto subsidized in Europe because there's a lower tax on diesel fuel. So it's always 10, 20 cents less expensive at the pump than gasoline. So that's obviously a huge incentive to buy a diesel.
You had a question, sir?
Yes, my name is Al Gessel. I'm actually a retired trailing spouse of a Yale faculty, but I worked for 32 years in California for a California oil company and with the Air Resources Board on fuel regulations. As a result, I got into a lot of contact with the regulators, but also the auto companies, a lot of joint research done with them. So for years, I kind of watched the development of diesel engines and how they were going to meet the emission standards that the Air Resources Board was going to impose. And it was a real struggle. You could tell, and I was close enough to tell that there was a lot of anguish in the industry how they were going to meet these things. I remember Honda in particular talked to us several times about how diesel fuel could change to help them out. And they finally gave up the ghost. They really tried hard. They published papers. They had some really intriguing technology they were going to try. They gave it up. My question to you is, did you ever hear from any of Volkswagen's competitors about what they were doing? Those competitors all were trying to develop the technology. They must have seen that Volkswagen did it, you know, in some miraculous way, pulling some kind of magic out of the hat. But there's really no magic here. This just takes a lot of hard work and a lot of engineering expertise. They must have been highly suspicious. Did you ever sense that they had gone to the regulators and talked to the regulators about it, or and somehow tried to thwart VW from doing this, or did they? Have we yet to uncover another huge scandal where everybody was doing what Volkswagen was doing?
Well, in fact, Fiat Chrysler is having problems with their diesel pickup trucks at the moment. But in fact, in the book, I quote a guy named Bob Lutz, you might have heard of, who's a very famous auto executive who was high-ranking at, I think he worked for pretty much every auto company on the planet at one time or another. And he told me that he was at Chrysler at the time, and they knew Volkswagen was coming out with diesels, and they said, we better compete with this. So they tried to develop their own. And you know, Volkswagen was buying all these parts from suppliers like Bosch, Continental, and Chrysler bought the same components, and yet they couldn't make the cars compliant. And Lutz told me that he was yelling at his engineers, you know, how come Volkswagen can do it and we can't? And they finally gave up. And Lutz said, you know, I asked him, how come you didn't go to the regulators and say, you know, this is fishy? And he said, well, you don't throw your competitors under the bus like that. So I think that, I mean, nobody wants to be a snitch, but this was a case where I think they would have done everybody a favor if they'd gone to the regulators and say, there's something here that's not right.
But I think you, if I remember correctly, I don't know if it's in the same passage where you talk about this in the book, there was also disbelief that Europe's leading car company would actually be, you know, so, I don't know, would take on such a big risk. I mean, right? I mean, somebody told them, no, I mean, they're cheating. It's all the software. I don't know if people would have even believed that somebody would do that in some ways.
And I think that the regulators bought into the whole clean diesel thing.
Yeah.
And they looked upon Volkswagen as one of the more virtuous companies that other companies should emulate.
Yeah.
And I think it took them along, if you look at the way, at how long it took from this West Virginia study till they finally sort of cornered Volkswagen was a year and a half. And I think that part of the reason was because Volkswagen covered up, but I think the other reason was that the regulators just had a lot of trouble getting their minds around the idea that anybody could do something like this.
And I was sharing with you before that the combination we used to see around here was a Jetta TDI with a Bernie sticker. You know, those things sort of went together, and people who really felt that they deliberately bought this because they thought that they were doing the right thing. And so in terms of recovering from that kind of brand damage is I mean, it's like if Bernie Madoff asset management suddenly got sort of, you know, resurrected. I mean, it's not exactly a good brand to sort of then work with, I suppose. There was a question all the way in the back, and then we'll come.
Yeah, so my name is Mustafa Idi. I'm a first-year student in SOM. I'm interested to know how this scandal compares with the Takada airbag scandal, which had a bigger impact in the sense that people actually died and it was about safety as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question because there was also a GM ignition switch scandal that there was quite a few deaths. And that's really, I think, in a way, a quirk of the legal system in the sense that, you know, if you had a defective Takata airbag and a family member died because of that, that's obvious for you as an individual, an enormous thing. and the settlement of the GM ignition switches where the cars would not shut off and people got in accidents, and there's several dozen fatalities as a result of that. But the cost of the companies was much lower because they only had to pay off this relatively small number of people that had actually suffered fatalities, and they were big payoffs, millions of dollars, but still 100 people times a million is, is a billion. So that has a lot to do just with the legal system, and also the fact that if you didn't suffer this, then there was no damage to you. Volkswagen basically hurt everybody who's ever breathed the exhaust, and every single person who bought a car was defrauded, was sold a car that didn't do what it was supposed to do. So you had every single owner had a claim against Volkswagen. So the settlement in the US worked out to about $15,000 per owner, but multiplied times 600,000 cars, plus fines and everything, it came to wind up being, 25 billion.
And to your point about the sort of difficulty of the engineering problem, right? A lot of owners said, well, fix it, and we can't fix it. I mean, that's sort of part of the problem, right? I mean, you redesign the car and sort of change the trunk, or, I mean, for a lot of these engines, it just wasn't a simple fix.
Right.
Or at least none that wouldn't have resulted in a big performance loss or anything like that.
Right. The airbags, they could recall the cars and fix them. But as you say, they have still not been able to come up with a technical fix that makes the Volkswagens compliant.
Right. There you go. There's a question right there. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kayla. I'm a dual degree student at the business school and the School of Public Health. I'm sort of wondering, I didn't actually realize, I haven't been following this very closely still, and I didn't realize the scale of the damages and fines and legal costs and everything. Is consensus now that they're going to survive through the scandal, or, yeah, I guess that's the simple question.
I think short term, they're not in a lot of trouble financially. I mean, they have a lot of cash, so they had the money to pay the fines. But I do think that down the road they will start to have problems. It did damage their reputation. They managed to keep sales up, but they're giving a lot of incentives. And just anecdotally, you hear about amazing deals that they are offering people to try to hang on to market share and keep the cars moving. And the other thing is that it's a time of transition for the auto industry. That switching to battery-powered cars, self-driving cars, requires a lot of capital investment, a lot of research and development. That's very expensive. So all this money that they're paying in fines, they could certainly invest better in making this transition, and they'll be at a big competitive disadvantage in the future, I think, because of that. And then the other thing is, which we don't know for sure yet, but the value of these diesel cars has gone down. It's very clear, the resale value. So, and a lot of them are on leases. So when they come back from lease, Volkswagen, has to take the cars back. And when that starts to happen, it's kind of a financial time bomb that they'll have to start taking write-downs for the lower value. And I think that could happen pretty soon, and we'll start to see some real financial damage.
All right, so that wasn't a definitive yes, about whether they're going to survive.
Yes, thank you. I'm Sam Hayek. I'm a consultant in leadership. I'm focused on the herd mentality and the collusion, particularly for the US managers. You mentioned that there's at least between 100 and 1,000 people who knew about this device or this software. Did they think it was reputational risk that they were taking, meaning that it was unethical or was immoral, or were they, to your knowledge, did they know that it was illegal, meaning it's a criminal legal risk?
I think they were very aware that it was a criminal legal risk from the very beginning. And there were some people, when it first happened. I mean, there's a lot of people who go into emissions technology because they're genuinely idealistic. They wanted to have cleaner air, and they were upset that Volkswagen was doing this because that's not what they had signed up for. But they certainly underestimated what the risk would be. As David mentioned earlier, I was told by somebody who was involved at the first iteration of this illegal software, and they thought, well, if the EPA finds out, they're not going to be very happy. We'll probably have to pay a fine of around $5 million, something like that. They hadn't done a systematic analysis of the risk. There was no mechanism for doing that. So they completely, I mean, obviously, if they understood what the risks would be, they would never have done it. But I think it's a question of short-term versus long-term thinking and just trying to, get through the next week or month or whatever and hold on to your job and not thinking about what the long-term consequences were going to be. And that's where corporate culture comes in, because you have to have a culture where people do not behave that way.
Let's go over there.
Hello, my name is Arthur Nacht. I'm an alum of the drama school, and I have an MBA from elsewhere a long time ago. I'm wondering, you refer to the $25 billion penalty. That is really a penalty paid by the stockholders. And I wonder who has actually paid a personal price for this misbehavior. And does a secondary question would be, is there any mechanism in Europe that corporate people who are found to have broken the law have some personal liability to the company, financial liability to the company for their misdeed?
Yeah, well, just to answer the second part of the question first, yes, there is. There have been cases where companies sue former chief executives. There's been talk that Volkswagen would sue Martin Winterkorn, the former chief executive, but I'm not sure of the status of that. Wait, remind me the first part of your question again about the...
But can you say something about criminal liability? So are people going to be held accountable at just stockholders?
Right. The first question was about the stockholders. Well, in this case, the stockholders have certainly suffered and paid. I mean, the stock price fell by half after this happened. I guess the one thing you can say about that is that half of the stock is owned by the Porsche family, of which this guy Ferdinand Piëch was a member. So in a sense, they were being punished for being bad managers, I think. And so maybe there's a certain justice to that. And then another 20% is owned by the state of Lower Saxony, which has a lot of control over management as well. So the people who are suffering the most financially are people who also could have prevented it if they had been more alert. So that maybe gives it a certain amount of justice.
And is anybody going to go to jail?
Well, so far it's been 4 people have gone to jail, either pre-trial or conviction. 2 people, both Germans, who happened to be in the United States, so they were within the reach of the US Justice Department. Germany doesn't extradite its own citizens. But then just quite recently, the German investigators who were also pursuing the case have started to make arrests. And just last week, they arrested a guy named Wolfgang Hatz, who was the highest ranking person so far to be arrested. And he was just below he was head of engine development at Audi and then later Volkswagen Group and also Porsche, and longtime associate of all the top people at Volkswagen, including the current chief executive. So I would think that's making people in Wolfsburg pretty nervous, because he's in pretrial detention in Munich, and they're certainly putting pressure on him to testify against the others. We'll see where that leads, but it's moving higher up in the organization chart, for sure.
I don't know who goes next. All right. Why don't we collect just a couple, because we're about to be out of time. So why don't we go around the room and just collect a couple of...
Is there any evidence this goes beyond just like the diesel engines into other cars? I might be saying that because I have a GTI with an engine light on, but I'm just always curious, like if it's cheating in one spot, is it cheating somewhere else?
Right. Did the cheating go beyond diesel? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, I think, what is the extent of fudging that happened? of the nitrous oxide.
Yeah. Was it just a little bit, or was it
Yeah,
a lot?
and how does it compare to emission test here in the United States? I think there's a lot of fudging going on there. So how do the two compare?
Okay. And then
I was going to ask, what are the whistleblower laws like in Germany? Because it's so interesting to me that so many people could know, and yet you wouldn't have a whistleblower. And then just an aside, and a remark as an attorney, I'm Eileen O'Connor, I'm here at Yale. As an attorney, the most famous international jurisdiction case is Volkswagen. It's surprising to me that they didn't think internationally, because it's actually one of the most famous cases that every law school student learns about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because basically Volkswagen was doing business in the United States, and so the fact that their business, and they were selling cars in the United States, meant that they were liable for this accident that occurred with a Volkswagen car. So, I mean, it's every kid knows, every law students, it's taught in civil procedure. So anyway, just an aside. But more importantly, whistleblower laws, what are they like?
Great, okay.
So let's take those three and then.
Also, does it affect other cars? Yes, there is a separate case involving Volkswagen exaggerating the carbon dioxide ratings. In other words, claiming that the cars were produced less carbon dioxide than they actually did. And that's a separate case in Germany. It hasn't gotten as much attention, but that's also part of the criminal case.
We don't know if that's the source of your check engine light.
Yeah.
The question of the fudging.
Yeah, how much? Well, I mean, it was pretty extreme. Different readings for different cars, but there was a Jetta I think it was a 2009 Jetta that was tested by the crew from West Virginia University that was at times, I think 45 times over the limit in terms of nitrogen oxides. So quite extreme. I mean, basically the emission system wasn't working. It was just putting out raw emissions onto the street.
This wasn't a little rounding error.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, the device it was incredibly sophisticated, right? I mean, they took data from 35 different sensors and complicated algorithm, and I don't want to sound like there's admiration for the sophistication of it, but this was not like a little fudge here. I mean, this was
right. No, it took some doing to build this thing.
Yeah.
And in a backhanded way, it is sort of a testimony to Volkswagen engineering prowess, because the other type cheating that we know about was much cruder, where they would just program the emissions to shut off after 20 minutes because the test lasts 18 minutes,
Yeah.
And Volkswagen had all these parameters in the engine computer, and it was pretty sophisticated, but that, of course, also shows the level of criminal intent.
There you go. When German engineers cheat, then they're all in. So, which brings us right back to this whistleblower question, which is just stunning.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not an expert on the whistleblower laws. I know that Volkswagen had an ombudsman system within the company that they put in after this prostitution scandal that I mentioned. I don't think it was taken seriously by employees, and I don't think people felt that they could go to the ombudsman without suffering some kind of repercussion. In terms of German law, maybe you know more about that than I do, David. As far as I know, I mean, I think in the US there's financial incentives to be a whistleblower. As far as I know, that doesn't exist in Germany. Whether there's any protections, I'm not aware of any.
One of the things that is so surprising about this, but perhaps also helps explain it, and I think you capture it well in the book and alluded to it before, is that there was a certain amount of self-righteousness there about thinking that US laws just were perhaps silly and too restrictive, and people didn't realize how wonderful this technology was. And when the Americans figure out how they need to change their law, we'll be in good shape. I mean,
Right.
rather than the other way around.
Yeah, no, definitely. They felt that the regulators were asking them to do the impossible.
Yeah.
You want not much carbon dioxide because of global warming. You don't want nitrogen oxide because of the health effects. And at the same time, we have to sell these cars to people. They have to have acceleration and fuel economy. And how do you reconcile all that? And in fact, it is difficult.
Right. So we're out of time, and I want to do the impossible now, which is, we're at a school of management. There's so many lessons here for managers. And the story is still going on. We still don't know everything. what are, of all the different things that people should learn from this about what they shouldn't do or what they should do instead, what are the one or two or three lessons where you say, this case, this story really tells us that you should always do X and never do Y?
I think I'd say there's two big takeaways. One is just the importance of management behavior and what signals that sends to people down the organization. Because whatever compliance system you have and rules and codes of ethics, it's all pretty meaningless if the top management is clearly behaving in a different way, which was the case at Volkswagen. And I think that's the main takeaway. I think the other thing is that, talking about the risk that they were taking, I gave another talk at NYU, and there was a guy who said that he'd worked at a company where they actually had software when they were doing their tax strategy. They were looking at what's the reputational damage of using this Cayman Islands tax shelter versus paying our taxes. And it wasn't necessarily doing something illegal, but something that would offend some people, seem unpatriotic or whatever. And they'd actually had software that calculated the relative costs to make a decision. And that just struck me as the most absurd thing I'd ever heard, because there's no way to predict what the risk is going to be. And I think the only solution, nobody would have predicted that this would be so expensive for Volkswagen. And the only solution is really just to do the right thing from the beginning. It's very simple, just don't do bad stuff, and there's no risk.
It's as simple as that. Doesn't get
simple,
simpler.
but in practice, it's hard. I know.
Yeah.
But really, that's the only. You're never going to come up with a software that's going to tell you what the real risk is. You just have to do the right thing.
There you go. And there are no shortcuts there. We're going to leave it at that. I'm so glad that Eileen is here. I wanted to thank you for supporting this event through the Poynter Fellowship, and thanks to all of you for coming and for your questions. And of course, most importantly, thank you, Jack, for the great work that you've done covering the story, writing the book, and sharing insights with us here today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Really appreciate it. As a reminder, we will have copies of the book available for sale outside, and I hope you're warm and
more than happy
to sign and ready to sign. Thank you.
Thank you.